for the cloud. Thank you very much. There's all kinds of new little features every time I get on here. All right, so let everybody get a chance to connect here. And all right, welcome everybody to a Free Thinkers Corner live Zoom event with Sisters in Crime New England. Really quick, before we get started, just want to remind everybody, or let everybody who is joining us, who's not part of the panel, please keep your video off and your microphones off. If you do have any questions, that just keeps down the confusion and any inadvertent, you don't want to be seen on Facebook Live, because we're Facebook Living this as well, plus recording it. So if you do have a question or comment, please use the chat box there. Now, Facebook Live, everybody over there, I am watching that. So if you have a question or comment on Facebook Live, please use the comment section and I will relay it to our panel. So tonight's presentation is called Death in Shorts, Writing Short Stories. Many mystery novelists also write murderous short stories. Tonight we're going to learn how writers plot, construct, populate the short mystery, from the lighthearted to the noir tale. Our guest panelists tonight from Sisters in Crime New England are Steve Liskow, Cheryl Marcio, Lorraine Sherman Nelson, and Tonya Price. And I do want to give a shout out to Sisters in Crime National along with Sisters in Crime New England, because we were just awarded a $500 grant for the We Love Bookstores from Sisters in Crime. So we're really excited and pleased about that.
Congratulations.
So thank you. So I'm going to pop off here now. This is your show. Have at it.
Who wants to start off?
You're on. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm Lorraine Sharma Nelson. I'm the Vice President of Sisters in Crime New England. And I love short stories. I love writing mysteries. I've written short stories across every genre, but I have to say that writing mystery short stories is my favorite. I love thinking up new ways to kill people, and poisoning is my thing. So, with that really comfortable, announcement, I'll turn it over to one of the other writers.
Okay. I'm Steve Liskow. I'm in Connecticut. I joined Sisters in Crime years ago because I needed to learn how to write better, and several people said Sisters in Crime has great workshops, and they do, and they have great panels like this. And I found a real camaraderie. I'm in other groups too, but this is, I think, in many ways the most active one for writers on the way up. I've written 16 novels, and while I was writing them, I did try to write short stories, because I was told if you publish a few short stories, it was a good way to get an agent's attention. I never really got an agent's attention, but I've written a lot of short stories, and I'm finding I'm writing more of them now. I love short stories just because you can stretch and really try new things with them. So that's pretty much it for me.
So I'm Cheryl Marceau. I live in the Boston area. I've been a member of Sisters in Crime New England for, I can't even remember how many years. And I started, my first meeting, I went with some trepidation because, like many writers, I'm an introvert. And I thought, all right, I'm going into a room full of strangers. How am I going to handle this? Some of these are well-known writers. This is going to be weird. It was wonderful. It was a warm, accepting, welcoming group, and I haven't looked back. I started writing short stories because I was working a ridiculous full-time job that had me leaving the house at 7 o'clock in the morning, getting home at 8 o'clock at night, traveling all the time, doing all kinds of ridiculous hours. And quite frankly, although I had a novel in progress, I couldn't ever focus on the novel. But short stories, I could plot while I was driving to work. I could think through all the threads in the short bursts of time that I had available to work on them. And it turns out that, like Steve, I've come to, and like Lorraine, I've come to love writing them because I find the precision you have to use to write a short story is a wonderful discipline. It really makes you focus. And I really enjoy seeing what I can do in the fewest possible words. And I don't always kill people. I sometimes commit other kinds of crimes, but the crime element is always there, and that's really satisfying for me also. So over to you, Tanya.
Thanks. Yeah. I guess I'm a little different. I have always loved short stories. When I was a kid, I read tons and tons of anthologies of short stories. And my goal is, I first wrote, my mom used to like to say that the first short story I wrote, which I didn't actually write, but when I was 2 years old, I came with some paper and a pencil and I handed it to her and said, I need you to write this down. I'm going to tell you a story. And I've been telling stories ever since then. And when I was in high school, my family, my mom and dad had an agreement. As long as I got up for church in the morning, I could write all night long. And I could usually Friday night and Saturday night write a short story and Friday and Saturday night. So I've done that all my whole life. And my goal was to be really a great short story writer. I never thought about novels. I wanted to write short stories. So that's what I've always done. I have written 3 novels. I haven't gotten any of them published at this point, but I really love short stories, and that's really been a lot of my focus. And I think it's a great background for any writer, because if you do have novels, then you can write short stories that pertain to it. It's a way to get people interested into your novels. It's a marketing tool, I think, for a lot of writers, and it really does hone your technical skills, I think.
So how would each of you describe the process? How do you come up with a story idea, and how do you approach that idea when it comes to writing a short story? Steve, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Basically, there are 2 ways that I approach a story. One, I'm discovering more and more, I look at submission guidelines, and if somebody wants a particular theme or a particular subject, I can use that kind of as a writing prompt and go with that. The other is just ideas come to me. I think it was Neil Gaiman who once said, a writer's job is to get ideas. If you don't get ideas, you're not a writer. Become an athlete or something. But when I get an idea, there are 2 things I can do. One of them is just jot down a couple of notes on it and let it simmer. Or the other one is, if I'm at the health club, I can talk them through while I'm on a machine, because I don't have to think. I can just let my mind run free. And I just give myself permission to write junk. The nice thing about a short story is, even if you write a lot of junk, it's only 4 or 5 or 6 pages. It's not like a novel that you get lost in and have to discard 100. And I'm finding that if I write a lot of junk at first, even in the first day or 2, just write a few paragraphs, eventually that will trigger better ideas. And then it's just a matter of going back and adding and rewriting and cutting and pasting. It sounds very sloppy, but it becomes more focused the farther I get, and as I do it more.
What about you, Cheryl? What's your process?
So I start with either a situation or a setting. And a recent short story I published was about a massage appointment gone terribly wrong. And it started with me on the massage table, believe it or not, thinking, what if? Now, that doesn't sound very relaxing, but the truth of the matter is, that's just, to Steve's point, that's just how, once you start writing short stories, that's how your brain starts to function. Sometimes it's a setting. I was in, my husband was playing music for a dance camp. This setting with all the interesting people at it felt like some place to write a short story about. And I said, okay, what could I have happen at this camp that would be an interesting mystery story? And so almost all of my stories are based on either a situation like I'm in a massage appointment, or I read about a weird thing that happened, or about a setting I really want to use.
Great. And Tanya?
Yeah, it depends on the kind of story that I'm writing. I write a lot of historical fiction. short stories. And so there, I usually just start doing research on something I'm interested in. And I always start, I guess I always start with an interesting character in an interesting setting with an interesting conflict. And then if it's historical, I'll just start researching, and one thing will lead to another. It's a lot of fun. And I end up usually coming up with an idea that way, or a character, or maybe a setting. I always have bits of my own life in my stories. I don't know why. Maybe because I've been doing it for so long. I started so young. But there's always some little thing that happened to me that will often connect with the research that I'm doing. If it's historical, if it's not historical and it's something else, then I'll just pick something from my life, and then I take it and I explode it into something that's total fiction, but it starts with some kernel of something that really happened to me, or happened to somebody I know, or somebody in my family, or whatever.
For me, it starts with a title. If I can come up with a title that pops into my head for whatever reason, based on something I've seen or heard or read about, I usually go from there. I pick a title, and then the story tends to come to me from the title. And I know I don't know too many people who do that, but I know R.L. Stein does that, and I know him for many years, so I feel like I'm in good company, with him. What about your methods of murder? Like Cheryl said, you don't always have to have a death in your stories, but I mean, surely you guys all have your favorite methods of killing off people. Anyone want to jump in there?
I've used several. I've done some kind of arcane. I want to backtrack for just a minute. I think Tanya made a very important point when she mentioned character, setting, and conflict, because a short story is very much an exercise in what you can leave out. And you only need a few basics, and they are a character, a conflict, and a setting, and maybe a resolution to the plot. But I think we all will touch on that more. I've done some fairly arcane murders. I had somebody strangled with a guitar string in one of my stories. I had somebody who was drunk drinking what he thought was powdered sugar, and it was ground glass. He had a rather unpleasant end. I had somebody strangled. I've done a certain number of shootings, but my two favorites are the guitar string and the ground glass.
Cheryl?
So, of the murders that I've committed, I've had somebody pushed overboard on a deck out on the ocean. I've had somebody bopped on the head with a heavy shovel, and I've had somebody poisoned in an intriguing way. And I won't say more than that because it would give away a short story that I've recently published. But yeah.
Okay, bopped on the head with a shovel. And you did, like Steve said, you brought some interesting points on the basic bones of writing a short story. So do you have any interesting murders or deaths you would like to report or not?
I basically write thrillers. And so in my thriller, somebody's trying to kill the person from the very beginning, and they're trying to escape. In the meantime, they sometimes do kill the person, but usually it's them trying to escape. And the guy and the person might end up dead in the end, but it's not always the protagonist, the person being chased, who does the killing. So I actually don't murder a ton of people in my stories, although they often die.
So do you have serial killers, one of some of your tropes that you go to, or are these are just people that reach the edge and
Yeah, no, it's usually I'm trying to think. It's usually somebody who, for one circumstance or another, ends up in a situation where they might observe somebody killing somebody. They might have stumbled onto something that is the reason that somebody tries to kill them. Somebody may be trying to do something, commit a crime, and then they walk in the middle of it, and then they end up the one being chased. But usually, like I said, they're trying to get away. They're trying to keep from being murdered, actually.
I'm not sure that you brought up some really good points, because that I'm not sure if people are not familiar with with mysteries in general, except for just like reading a crime story. There are so many different parts to a mystery. I mean, like the suspense and the thriller and the cozy mystery, which will take place maybe in a small village somewhere and have an amateur sleuth, hunting for the killer, or a police procedural where it involves a detective. So there's so many different ways in which to take your mystery, and I think all of us have different types of mysteries that we end up writing, that appeal to us. So if anyone has any questions about any particular type of mystery that they're interested in, feel free to ask questions. We'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate real quick, so everybody, because we had just a few people just join us, if you would just please keep your mics and videos off, that keeps down confusion. Use the chat box. I do have a question in the chat, though. Lisa would like to know the most unexpected turn of events each of you found yourself writing, the outcome you didn't expect.
I was working on a novel several years ago. It very rarely happens to me in short stories, but I was about 80% of the way through a novel, and I realized that a different person was really the culprit. I realized it was a lot more logical and at the same time a lot more surprising. And so I had to do a quick revision on about the last 50 or 60 pages and then go back through the previous 200 and some and make sure that I could just plant a clue that would go in that direction. That only happened once. Generally, my short stories, I have a pretty good idea who did it, and a lot of my short stories aren't really mystery or whodunit so much as somebody either getting away with something or exacting some kind of horrible vengeance. A lot of my stories, the person at the end who died, I think the reader's reaction is the SOB had it coming.
So I had a story that I really wanted to tell, one of the ones that was about a setting I wanted to use. And it was a very vivid, powerful, emotionally wrought setting. And I really wanted to use this. And I really wanted it to be a murder. And I realized there was no way in the confines of a short story that I could make it a murder and have it play out the way I wanted it to play out if it had been a murder. So what I did was create a completely different crime with a completely different set of outcomes than a murder would have entailed. And I love the character. I'm probably going to revisit that character in another story or even maybe a novel length manuscript, but it just had to go a different direction than a murder. And all my efforts to the contrary, that's what happened.
Great. What about you, Tanya?
Yeah, I'm debating because I want to talk about a story that was just sold and they haven't announced it yet. But I think I can do it. So I'm going to go out on the limb and try. What I find with my stories is there's what's called a plotter and a planner. And a plotter is somebody who sits down and knows the entire story before they start writing. And a plotter is somebody who basically comes up with a cool idea and then starts writing the story and kind of goes along and discovers for themselves the story as they go along. And I find that I'm a planner. I'm a planner. It's a project manager, so it makes sense. I'm a planner. I have to know the beginning and the end. But inevitably, while I write the story, I turn into this plotter and my stories go off in a completely different way. And so in the last story that I wrote a Christmas story. And in the end, the protagonist saves the life of Stalin. And the editor wrote me back and said, I can't believe I'm going to buy a Christmas story that saves Stalin. But, that's how it turned out. I didn't know in the beginning. That was not at all the end. But as you write the story, it takes its own life. And that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to love reading that story. But to answer your question, Lisa, I wrote one story where it took place at a circus, and the magician was doing a magic act, and it was the sword through the volunteer, and obviously the actual steel part of the sword kind of slides back into the sheath of the sword, and he had planned it so that it wouldn't be retracted back in, and this particular volunteer would die. And as it turns out, I was so sure that the magician was the killer. And as it turns out, it wasn't him. It ended up being someone else, one of the other circus trainers, one of the other circus acts. And I don't want to say who it is, but it totally threw me for a loop because I had my whole story planned for the magician to be the killer. And that was actually part of the name of the story too, Magically Misunderstood, because it had to do with magic. And I tried really hard to bring it around to the magician, and it just didn't work. So I had to let that go and then realize that somebody else, there was a higher power working and somebody else was actually the murderer, so that, I guess that happens to all of us, and even the most, like strenuous planners like Tanya.
I'm finding that I used to plot out my novels very carefully. It would change as I was going along, but I would do more or less an outline, and I would find that as I was writing each individual scene, I would discover I had to add something or move something, and I would do a lot of that. So by the time I finished a first draft of a novel, I'd be on the 14th outline. I'm finding I don't do that at all. I'm more of a pantser on these short stories. I start in somewhere, write a couple of pages of absolute garbage, and find what I can save and what I can change, and just kind of keep saving and changing and going on as I go. For a quick example now, I saw a submission call from Michael Bracken last week for Black Cat Mystery Magazine, and bless his heart, he really was specific. He said, this is the kind of stuff we see far too often. This is the stuff I wish I saw a lot more. And he said, we get a lot of spouses killing each other and a lot of revenge. We don't get a lot of capers or heists. And we don't get any locked room puzzles. Well, a locked room puzzle is a little bit beyond me, but I said a caper or a heist. I've never tried that. So I started writing, and the hard part was finding how to get in. I wrote about 5 lousy openings, and I now have a complete first draft. It's an absolute mess, but I think all of the right stuff is in there, so it's a matter now of just cutting and pasting and then making the prose and the dialogue better. But it was about 7 drafts I wrote spliced together over the course of a week, and it was because I just said, oh, here's an idea someone gave me.
Mm-hmm. And I want to pick up on that because my one and only fiction writing class I took as a very late in adulthood learner, and it was an adult ed program on creative writing. It was not about mystery writing, but the instructor talked about the scaffolding of your story. And she said, you're going to start in, you're going to have a lot of scaffolding, and you will find when you've written it that much of that scaffolding can go away. You needed it to get into the story. To Steve's point, you needed that framework. But then when you finish that draft, you can cut all of the scaffolding that you don't need. And so, yes, the first draft tends to be an awful mess. And you work your way through what you need and let go of the rest.
And I actually really agree with that, Cheryl, because I find that when I'm writing, especially when I'm about 3/4 of the way through the story, I start thinking to myself, this is not going to work. I can't see how it's all coming together. I can't see how it's all going to flow. I mean, I may know who the murderer is, or I may know how I want to resolve that murder, but I feel like it's very choppy and it doesn't flow the way it should. And usually I have to force myself to finish the story. And then once I have the framework, it's easier to go back and then mold it into what you want,
Yeah.
So here's a question. What defines, or I should say differentiates a short story from a novella or a novel? And then for each of you, what was your shortest short story length? What was your longest short story length?
It's just a matter of length, and people argue about the word count in a novella or a novelette. I've seen, the Black Orchid Novella Award is open only to a story between 15,000 and 20,000 words. I've seen other people say a novella is a lot longer. And some people say a novelette is longer than a novella, but I've never seen a hard and fast piece. My shortest published short story, I think, was about 1,500 words. I have a couple out that are shorter that haven't been sold. My normal length is probably around 4,500 to 5. My longest was about 17,000. That won the Black Orchid Novella Award and was published in Alfred Hitchcock about 5 years ago.
I think I agree with Steve as far as the length goes. I think novellas can go anywhere from about 15,000 to maybe 25, 30,000. It kind of depends on what the publisher, determines is a novella. But my shortest story is probably about 1,000 words, and it actually won a prize for it was a science fiction mystery. And it's one of the stories that I had the most fun writing because I only had 1,000 words in which to tell the story, and it really forced me to focus and concentrate and make every word count. And I think my longest story was probably about 10,000 words. And I do find with the longer ones that I tend to kind of go off track and find myself going off topic, and that I constantly have to bring myself back and focus on the story at hand. And I end up doing a lot of editing because it ends up being way longer than it needs to be. So with the 10,000, I find that I have a harder time with the longer story, with the longer word lengths than with the shorter. I'm more disciplined with the shorter, and I kind of tend to let myself go with the longer ones.
Yeah, the other thing is, so short stories, and I'm talking what are traditionally considered short stories versus novellas. Short stories tend, because they are so short, between typically 1,000 to 7,000 words, whatever the definition is, and it's, as Lorraine said, by publisher typically, but those tend to focus on a specific situation, a fairly well-defined time period, not a lot of subplots, because you don't have time to develop all of that. And you have to do some things. You can't do a lot of character development. You have to use a few words to develop each character. You have to use a few words to develop the setting. There's very limited scope for development. So it tends to mean you can't have a very elaborate plot. You have to have a very simple, straightforward plot relative to a novel. Novels can be as intricate and complex as the author wants, because you've got anywhere from 70 or 80,000 words to 120,000 words typically for most novels. Although I think publishers do have limits, upper limits in particular on novels, but still, that's a lot of room.
Tanya, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, actually, it's great conversations. I have several things I wanted to say, but one is the thing that comes to mind first is a short story is a moment in time. And I always remind myself that it's a moment in time. And that's one of the big differences with a short story. And even, I don't know about a novella, I've never thought of it that way, but certainly a novel. And so that's why a short story has to do so much so quick. And so you'll see when you look at short stories that the writer is integrating. I talked about setting, character, and conflict. That's all integrated often in the first page. That kicks the story off, and you look at the ending, you're going to go back to the beginning. You're going to see that was all really sort of developed right from the very beginning. And so I had a short story. The shortest story I've ever wrote was about 3,500 words. And it's interesting to listen to everybody and talk about how they've won awards and things from their shorter work, because that's the story that got published or was chosen for the Best American Mystery Stories in 2019. And I think in part it's because that was a story where I was able to really focus on the moment in time. It also hit me that that's one of the few stories I had where I actually did murder somebody. Didn't know I was going to murder somebody until the very end, but they were going to be killed, but they managed to murder the other guy. So I was able to do it that way. And just interesting what you said about the middles. I think, Lorraine, you were the one talking about how you get going. And the best advice, writing advice I ever got was every writer, when they get to the middle of the story, feels like it's not working. And the reason is because the beginning's exciting, the ending's exciting, the middle is the bridge. And the best writing advice I got was continue to write, push through it, and then reread it. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to find that middle was just fine. It just doesn't have that excitement that you have in the beginning and the end, but you need that.
So Lorraine, I have, well, Leslie has a question, which I'll get to in just a second, but Lorraine, you did touch on something that I did want to ask too. You said you had a short story, you were going and you decided you had to stop and pull it back. Otherwise it would have become more of a novel. Has anybody had that problem and just gone on to create the novel out of it instead of the short story? Or do you stop and you pull yourself back? And what are some of the things that you cut out to keep it a short story versus just continuing on as a novel?
I haven't done that. Joseph Conrad actually started Lord Jim as a short story, and it got away from him. But I actually had a short story that I couldn't sell because it was about 7,000 words, which was more than several publications would take. And then when I heard about the Black Orchid, I wondered if I could expand that. And I did. I expanded it and sent it in there. I got it up to about 15,000. I think one of the things, and I'm not sure if Cheryl said it or Tanya, but going back to the difference between a novella and a short story and a novel now, for me, in addition to word count, is subplots. A longer story or a novella, I usually try to put in at least 1 or 2 subplots because otherwise it just feels very linear and very thin. It's the kind of thing, imagine if Hemingway had tried to turn The Old Man and the Sea into a full novel. It would have just felt very threadbare. It was wonderful as a novella, but as a novel, there just wasn't enough to work with.
Cheryl, do you want to add to that?
So I actually have only one short story that I really wanted to turn into a novel and decided I couldn't. In general, no, I don't tend to go there. My stories are specific things, points of time and situations that I want to work with. And I do find that I like the challenge of dealing with whatever that situation is in a short framework. And my shortest short story that's published is about 2,500 words. My longest is about 5,000 words, but I like to get as much as I can in the space that I've done it.
I have one question that I'm curious about your answers. Seeing as we are writing about crime and murder and all of that kind of fun stuff, do you have would you tell us your favorite ways to kill off the bad guy, or to kill off the good guys, and have another good guy go after the bad guys? At any rate, your favorite ways to kill off someone. Tanya, you were laughing. Do you have a favorite way?
No, I'm laughing because I don't usually kill anybody.
Right. I know you don't, but I'm sure. Do your bad guys not think those thoughts about if they were to get a hold of whoever they're chasing? What they would.
The bad guys are always trying to kill people. Yeah, so that's usually the plot: is the bad guy is trying to kill somebody for various reasons. Yeah, I actually wonder if I can just put that on pause and just talk about the last point I just wanted to make, and that is every short. I said I had written 3 novels. All 3 of them were ones where editors came to me and said, "This short story needs to be a novel. You need to make this a novel," and that's how I ended up writing the novel. So I actually have been in the opposite situation where I was trying to write short. And then I had too much, basically had thrown so much into the short story that they wanted it to be a novel. And so that's usually the way that it goes. Yeah, my killing, when I murder somebody, it's usually pretty straightforward. It's with a gun, it's with a knife, it's with, no poison for me, man. I just go and I kill him and I move on with the story.
The reason I ask is that I do get comments from mystery readers and fans who just love to hear the juicy details. So I figured it's something they would be interested in hearing about.
I'm looking back through my records now, and I find one of the most bizarre things I did. This was actually a girl who was at a convenience store. She was working a convenience store, and two guys came in and tried to rob the place. And she realized she recognized one of them, and he realized it too. They're wearing ski masks, but she grabbed a can of hairspray and a lighter and sprayed the ski mask and used the lighter as a blowtorch and set his face on fire.
That's creative.
He didn't die, but he really didn't have a lot of dates after that.
So the question we have from Leslie is, she finds herself writing darker stories than her first novels were. Has anyone else had this experience? She also tends to write more suspense and mystery. Same question to everybody.
Yeah, I actually typed a response to that a few minutes ago. I saw it in the chats. So I'll let somebody else answer.
Yeah, I tend to, my short stories, I have a few light ones, and my early, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I was going to say my earliest short stories were actually pretty light, but they varied widely, and they were actually a mix of very dark and not very dark. None of my short stories are real hardcore noir, but they are dark and creepy. One of them almost qualifies as a ghost story. Although it isn't exactly. One of them is a pretty macabre psycho killer kind of story, and the psycho killer, how that psycho killer kills is less important than what the psycho killer does with the remains.
Oh.
So, but I don't tend to have a real consistent pattern. If there is one, it might be poison, because I think I've used that more than most, but it's all over the place. It depends on what the situation will bear.
Yeah, I tend to use poisons a lot because I feel I can get creative with them. I had submitted a story for a Mardi Gras anthology, and I had an actual poison that was slow acting because I needed to make sure the victim was away from the killer so that no suspicion fell on him. And the editor came back and said, I love the story, but I don't feel that that poison can be that slow acting. Can you add another, do something with that? And I thought, well, I'm going to make up something. I'm just going to add, because he works in a lab, I'm going to have him add a little bit of this and a little bit of that and come up with something. And because his name was Dan, he came up with the Dan Slam, he called it, so sometimes you're forced to actually, use your imagination, and go with that if something in the real world doesn't work for you. So poisons tend to work for me. I can get very creative with them, when I need to. But about the dark, writing dark stories, I feel that my earlier stories were much darker than the ones I have now. And I don't know if it was because of the pandemic, but I found myself writing more mystery-based, lighter stories last year, maybe because I was just so depressed with everything around me. That the only times I tend to go dark is when I'm writing horror, and my horror tends to get really dark.
Yeah, I was wondering about the pandemic, if that wasn't the reason, because I've noticed that as well, that a lot of people are doing that. I did remember, though, I did kill somebody with a nail gun once.
If you think hard enough, you'll come up with someone that you've really done in a very memorable manner. But what about... how was your revision process? I'd like to know, first of all, what your thoughts are on the revision process and what tends to work for you.
I used to write an entire story and then go back and fix it. I no longer do that. I'm finding now that I will write a certain amount And then the next day, I will start by revising what I've done, tightening it up, cleaning up a little dialogue. And as I do that more and more, I understand the characters and the situation more deeply. And so the first half of the story is really a learning experience. By the time I'm about halfway through, I usually know the ending. And then it's a matter of getting that first draft done, and then I have to read the stuff out loud. That's where I hear the awkward sentences and the repetitions or the dialogue that just doesn't work for that character. But I generally do about 5 or 6 drafts, complete drafts of a story, as opposed to the little partial things before I send it out. And a lot of that is still finding that silly little typo where you did a cut and paste and you didn't get all the letters, or you've got a period and a comma together, or something like that. But the last thing I work on more often than not is the opening. You've got to get that right. That has to be in, and you cannot waste words. But it's very personal. It has to sound right. And I can't explain what anybody else would understand by that, but it has to sound right for you. It's a personal thing.
Cheryl?
Yeah, I will start with the idea, get something down on paper, push through. I won't typically do the whole first draft in one sitting, but pretty close. And then I start trying to figure out, and I have good friends and readers who read my stuff and help me to see what isn't working, but logical flaws, improbabilities, things that just don't hold together. And those are legion in the first draft, because there's just I tend not to be good about asking myself those own hard questions as much as I need to. So having somebody else push me and say, really could that happen, is very helpful to me. And I also want to make sure that I get the character right, the main character right. I want to make sure I've got the right voice for that character. I want to make sure that all the other characters interact well with that character. And I want to make sure that the ending is as satisfying as I can make it. I find openings, Steve's right that the opening's critical. I found those come to me much more easily. The endings are a bear. I struggle with the endings every single story. And sometimes it's just wording them well, and sometimes it's I really don't know how I want that story to end in a satisfying way until I've worked through it several times.
Tanya?
Yeah, my process is very similar to Steve's, I think, except maybe one exception, and that is I write and rewrite the opening until I hit the voice. And I find that I have to keep doing it. Now, I won't get all that far, get a couple of pages and say, no, this is just not right. I'll try it again and again. Some people do what they call walking to the story. And that's really their process of figuring out what their story is. And beginning writers will leave that in and send it off. And more experienced writers will say, oh, I'm walking to the story. Let me cut it off here. And now this is the punch. This is where the story really starts. And I think that my rewriting the opening is often just my walking through the story. I'm learning the character, I'm getting the setting, I'm getting figuring out the conflict. And then by the time I do that 5 or 6 times, I've got my opening, I've cut out the walking to the story on my own, and now the story takes off. And I find if I nail the beginning, the rest of the story generally goes pretty well and pretty fast. So. And then I revise as I go. So like Steve said, I'll go back the next day. I will then read from the beginning. I'll edit down. And usually by the time I get to the end, the story's in pretty good shape.
Well, I like what you said about walking to the story. I've found with all of these anthologies that mostly ask for 5,000 words and no more, I found that I have to start as close to the action as possible. Because you just can't, every single word has to count. Every sentence has to take you someplace else, so it's really important to get into the meat of the story as quickly as possible. So for me, my revision is all about taking out all those extraneous words that don't belong, because I'm constantly struggling to cut it down, because I do tend to write more and then end up paring it down, and so I have to think about that constantly, about does the sentence work? Is this important? Does it move the story forward? And if it doesn't, you have to cut it out.
So Lisa has a question. Can each of you tell us the story that's your favorite of all the ones you've written, even if it didn't get published?
Oh,
Eva, you're going to start?
Yeah, I have one. It's really not a mystery, but I wrote it years ago. It's loosely autobiographical, and it's about two college kids going to a muddy water. Well, they're going to a Martha and the Vandellas concert. This shows you how long ago it is. It's in the mid 60s. And the opening act is a bunch of guys they've never heard of. And these guys they've never heard of get up there and they play a couple of songs that the kids have heard that were done by the Rolling Stones, and a couple of songs that were done by the Yardbirds, and a couple of other songs they know from other bands. But these guys play them more slowly so they sound dirty. And the punchline is this opening act is the Muddy Waters Blues Band. And the next day, the male protagonist goes all over town trying to find a record by the Muddy Waters Blues Band, and he can't find one. He's never heard of them before, and he thinks they're great. And the punchline, of course, is the Yardbirds and everybody else are covering Muddy Waters songs, which the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds did. It's a true story. I actually saw Muddy Waters open for Martha and the Vandellas. I had no idea who they were. I wrote the story years later, and it was rejected by, I think, 15 different magazines. And I finally looked, they were mostly college publications, you know, the literary things, and I'm sure the editors were so young they had no idea who Muddy Waters was, because he died in 1983. And they're probably saying, this is a really stupid story, what's the point?
Carol?
So I think my favorite actually might be the first short story I ever finished and got published. And it was a while between start and publication, but it was based on something I'd seen in the paper about a body found in a motel in Vermont. And all of the victims' clothing had their tags cut out. And I mean, that just, and nobody, to my knowledge, nobody ever solved the crime. Nobody ever figured out how this could have happened, who she was, whatever. But she had died by drinking insect poison, the kind of stuff you put on your plants, and like house plants. And I wrote it from the viewpoint of the woman who died, and from the viewpoint of the cops that discover the body. And in the end, I people who read my stories a lot know I tend to favor ambiguous ending. I like ambiguous endings. I like making the reader work for it. Sorry, but I do. And it's a little ambiguous, but that one, I really wanted to leave that little bit of doubt in the reader's mind because it was an unsolved mystery.
Sounds really interesting. Wow. Tanya, do you have one favorite story?
oh yeah, well, my first thought was, gee, they're my babies. I love them all. They're all my favorite. But I do have one. And interesting, when you're a writer, you sometimes tell a story and it can be years before the story is published. And my favorite story, one of probably my favorite, is one that was bought 3 years ago, still hasn't come out. And as a writer, you have the option of writing the editor and saying, well, I'd like to have the story back so I can send it off to somewhere else. I was an exchange student for a year in Germany when I was in high school. And as part of that exchange, I was able to go to East Berlin when the Cold War was going on. Shows you how old I am. And so I wrote a short story which took all of the true stories of things I experienced during that day. One day we went to East Berlin, as well as different stories from the other 40 people. And I combined them into one story of one person, one American girl, going into East Berlin and meeting another American girl, and then what happened in the course of it. And it really showed the total culture clash. And the reason I think it's my favorite story was it encapsulated so many of the things that we saw as American students, and we were 16 years old, 16-year-olds going over and interacting with a completely foreign culture. And so that was my favorite.
Sounds really great. I think my favorite story is one that I think Lisa is familiar with. It's about a pyromaniac in Mumbai, India. And he starts these fires where, hundreds of people die because he is in love with the goddess of fire, and he wants to prove to her, that he is her ultimate follower, and that he is the love of her life. And so each time he sets fire to something, it's bigger and it's worse and more people die. And the more fires he starts, the more he starts to lose his humanity. It's a really dark story, but for me, I think that was my favorite story. And it was published by a sci-fi publisher.
So here's a question about character development. What is, or is there a difference in how you develop a character for a short story versus a novel?
Can you say that again, please? So the difference?
Is there a difference just in general or specifically to your writing? Is there a difference in how you develop your characters in a short story versus the characters you develop in your novels?
Yeah. In my novels, I do a lot of character backstory, and I know their family and their upbringing and their hobbies and their fears and all of their little foibles. In a short story, they only have to exist in this particular situation. So the character is kind of geared to the kind of person who would be in that situation, whatever it is, because I like to write with a very short timeline. Even if the story is several thousand words, ideally the story takes place in 24 hours or less. So all I need is somebody who would be in that situation. In fact, I think I have one story that lasts about 2 hours. That's the amount of time in the whole story.
Anya?
I'm sorry, would you mind just refreshing my memory as to what the question was? I've kind of
Sure.
lost track of it.
When you develop a character for your stories, is there a difference between how you do it for a short story versus how much you do it for a novel?
Right, thank you. Yes, I think that I would agree with Steve. Basically, they're more developed. When I write my short stories, I do a lot of, as I said, historical thrillers, and so I usually go and do what I don't believe all short story writers do. I do everything that I would do for a novel character in terms of building their entire background. But for a novel, the character is growing over the course of the novel. Mine usually have a longer time span in the novel, and so as part of that, then more layers get built onto the character, and that I develop as I go along. So that would be the main difference for me.
Carol?
Oh, it's interesting. That's an interesting question. I have noticed that the stories in which my characters are more fully developed are the stories that get received the best. So the richer the character, the better people respond to the story. And I don't tend to do a whole ton of backstory work with a short story character, but I do enough that I know who that character is. And sometimes it takes me a few rewrites of the story, to go back to what Steve and Tanya talked. It takes me a few rewrites sometimes to get to that character and what that character's story really is in the context of this piece of time, slice of time. But having enough for it to be a fully fleshed person is very important.
For me, the difference is that with a short story, I don't tend to have that much of a backstory for my main character, because I don't feel they're having that arc of growth, because they really don't have that much time to do a whole lot of, maturing or growing, so I'll just have like a basic background for them. This is their profession, this is kind of their age, and these are their hobbies, and those kind of things, which are really not that much. Whereas, of course, with a novel, I tend to do a much more elaborate backstory, and I will usually give them, along with a lot of different faults, like some major fault or issue that they need to work on, that needs to, that they need to, that when the reader gets to the end, they can actually see a growth, between where the character started off and where they ended. So for me, that's the difference,
Kind of on the same note, research. Now, I know with novels, you typically do a lot of research, especially historical novels, or when there's technical aspects of it, as far as weapons or poisons and things like that, specific places. Is there any difference between the research you do for a novel than you do in a short story? Does it need to be as technical, or does it need to be more technically correct or historically correct in a short story because you're trying to focus on that one part of the story?
It depends on the story. Some stories, if you're working, for example, with medical issues or computers or something like that, you have to do the research because you have to be accurate. On a novel, I tend to do a lot more research because on a story, generally, I'm making up the location so I don't have to worry, and I know something about the issues involved. If I need something, I'll just Google and say, oh, okay, that's that. But a lot of my novels, I've done quite a bit of research. It's much more unusual on a short story, at least for me.
Yeah, I tend to make sure I've got at least a plausible set of circumstances. So one short story, which has not been sold yet, but I'm hoping will soon, I needed to make sure that the setting actually worked for the plot I had in mind. So I researched, I had a particular geographic location in mind. I changed it in the story, but I needed to make sure that that geographic setting worked. And you could do what I wanted my protagonist to do in that setting and that time. Or if I have a poison, I want to make sure that there's a plausible poison. But one of my friends says, and I think this has really helped me a lot, for a good short story, you get in, you get out, and you don't give the reader time to think too hard about it. So you can get away, I think, with a certain amount of license in a short story that you couldn't possibly in a novel.
Tanya, do you agree?
Well, it's certainly not, I don't think the way that I do it, but that doesn't mean that it's, it doesn't work. What I find is I do a lot of research, but as I said before, I draw often on things that have happened to me one way or another. And so I usually know for a short story, sort of, I've been there, usually often it's setting, I've been there. And then I try to pick a setting that other people haven't been at and will find they learn something. I always try to have the reader learn something as a result of reading the short story. But I love when I can go to where I've been. And I've done that a number of times. We were just in the Berkshires and my husband said, oh, let's go up to the border of Vermont for a hike. And so we took this hike and I said, hey, wait a minute, that's the mountain I just put in a story I sent off to Alfred Hitchcock. And it was interesting. I'd done all the research on, Google Maps and everything on this mountain. When we got there, it was completely different. And that's why I am working on a young adult novel, actually. It's a thriller. It's a historical thriller. And my husband and I actually, as soon as we can travel, have this great trip planned where we're going to follow the entire route of a boy who's going from where he lands in France to Dresden and then back to the United States. And it happens during the final days of World War II. And so that's a trip we're really looking forward to. But I love to do the online research but then it's really fun and you learn a lot. And I think you get a lot of great ideas if you then can physically go there. So for novels, I really always try to physically go to where I'm going. And I write a lot of international historical thrillers. And so usually I'm trying to go to that, an international. I always try to get a trip abroad in there.
No, I tend to, I mean, I completely agree with you. There's nothing like actually being physically in a place, to actually get a feel for it. I know a lot of novelists, especially the ones in the Victorian period, used to write about places they had never been to, but they were so vividly researched and mapped out that you felt that you were actually there. Like Bram Stoker writing Dracula about the Carpathian Mountains. And you actually felt that he had actually made that trek out there by himself. And when you find out that he didn't, it's a little astounding to know the detail that he put into it. But I tend to be kind of, a Cheryl writer, in that get in, do your thing, get out. And I feel that with short stories, especially if they're not historical, like what you're writing, Tanya, you can get away with that a little more. There's a little more license, to invent.
So with on that note there, where you're writing about places that you've actually been to or times that you took part in, what about friends and family? Have you ever inadvertently or on purpose developed a character based on somebody you know? And would that person, if you have, would that person recognize themselves in that story?
Nobody wants to say anything.
I'm actually going to be doing a blog on that subject Monday on a site where I blog. I have borrowed traits from several people I know in a few novels, and they would not recognize themselves. I generally do something big to change them. The easiest thing to do, if it's not going to affect the plot, is switch gender. Or you can give them some odd mannerism that is completely different from something they do. Maybe somebody has an odd speech pattern, and you have them do something like cracking their knuckles instead. I did use one person, one of my high school classmates, inspired the female protagonist in one of my Private Eye series. And I acknowledged her in the acknowledgments and sent her a copy of the book because she knew if she had ever read it, she would have known instantly, oh, that's me. And I said, yes, it is you. So thank you. But outside of that, while I've used people fairly often, I don't think they would ever notice. That's called protection from lawsuits.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also called being able to show up at Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner with extended family or whatever.
Yes.
I have actually used my dad in one short story. He was not the victim. He was not the protagonist, but he was the very colorful character that the daughter was helping to address an issue he had. I wrote it after he passed. He would probably have gotten a laugh out of it. At least I like to think he would have, but I'll never know.
Yeah, I wrote, I have written stories after people have died. I wrote my parents' love story, and it really just sort of wrote itself. They had both passed away, and I called my brother. I said, because he's my only living relative. I said, do you think this is okay? Are you okay with it? Because we were in the story. And he said, no, yeah, go ahead. So I did do that. But generally, the advice I got when I started writing was take 3 characters, take 3 people. If you're going to take somebody take 3 people, combine them into one character. And the other advice I got was nobody recognizes themselves in the story. So don't worry too much about it, but gender, name, maybe ethnic identity or whatever, if it makes sense. But find something so they won't recognize it, and don't worry if you don't change it enough, because they're not going to recognize themselves anyway.
I tend to do a combination of both my kids. They're exceptionally smart, and
Of course.
both of them, and they're actually on here listening. So now the cat's out of the bag. But I tend to, whatever main character I have, they generally, and especially if it's police procedural or one of my detective stories, I tend to combine both my kids into one character, and think, okay, now, what would they do in this circumstance? How would they resolve this? What would they say going forward? So that doesn't mean I'm always going to use you guys, but I have used you in the past, just so you know.
So when you format your books or your short stories, how do you do that? Is it one just long thing? Do you break them up into small little chapters or page breaks? How do you format your short stories? Is it based on length?
It depends on the story. Sometimes I will break up scenes with 3 signs. Sometimes I won't break up anything. I don't think I've ever written a short story in chapters. My books have had chapters, but I don't think any of my short stories have.
So the one short story where I really had distinct starts and stops was the story I talked about with the woman who was found dead with her clothing, the labels cut out. And I basically alternated the cops and the woman's stories. And so that I had distinct breaks. Otherwise, sometimes I'll do a section break where the scene changes. But that's about it.
Yeah. Because I write thrillers, I don't usually break the story up because they're fast paced. You want to grab the reader at the very beginning, and you don't want to let them go. You don't want to give them any excuse to get out of the story till the story ends. The times when I have broken the story up, and I've published in all the different genres, and so the ones that I usually will break up are the romance stories, and I write romance suspense, which is also a type of mystery. And there I often will break it up, not necessarily going between viewpoints, although I sometimes do that. But the story might go through a longer period of time. For instance, the story Feel the Love, which was the one that I talked about, my parents' love story, that covered their entire life from the time they met until they died. And so that story is broken up that way.
For me, I never do chapter breaks of the short story. I will always just do a page break, and that's mostly to signify either a time change or a scene change. And those are the only two times I tend to use a page break. And obviously that's very different for an actual novel. For the young adult that I'm revising right now, there are not only page breaks, but there are very different chapter breaks as well.
So Tanya, you mentioned that you wrote the story of your parents over their lifetime. So obviously there must be some things that you had to leave out to keep it short. Has there ever been anything that you liked, that you loved so much, so you wrote it so well, but it's just too much for that particular story that you took it out, set it aside, and used it for, or are planning on using for, another story?
Well, that's a great question.
So well written that you just have to say this piece, but it just doesn't work in this story.
When that happens for me, what happens is that my story has gone off track. So I'm writing the story, and then suddenly I'm starting to pursue a different path. I'll stop the story. I think somebody mentioned this before. Maybe it was Lorraine, that she sometimes stops and then starts again, or goes in a different direction. I'll take that different direction. I'll put it in my idea file, and I'll make that another story. So I do it that way.
I don't think I've ever written anything so beautiful that I hate to cut it. I've written stuff that works. I have a whole file of stuff that I've cut that I may recycle somewhere. Sometimes it's a scene or it's a description. Or my first novel, I had to cut 7,000 words because the publisher had a particular word count, and I had to cut a supporting character. And I really liked that character, but he was expendable there. I would love to find a place to recycle him into another book. But I have a huge file. In fact, it's most of a flash drive of things that I've cut.
So I've never cut anything, but one of my short stories, Of all of the stories I've published, oddly enough, this one has gotten the strongest response from people who don't usually read mystery stories. And I'm very fond of it, but it was sort of interesting that so many people reacted so strongly to the main character, to the point that several people wrote to me and said, I really wanted more of this character. I really, really want to see what happens to this character next. And so I'm thinking that I will probably have to write at least another short story or two with that character.
For me, I had written a story for one of Level Beth's anthologies a few years ago, and it was a food-related one. And I had misunderstood the length of the word length. I thought it was, I didn't have my glasses on, and I thought it said 15,000 words, and I ended up writing about 17,000 and thinking, oh, I only have 2,000 words to cut. And then it turned out it was a 5,000 word story. So I ended up having to cut 12,000 words. And I had actually added a whole subplot because I thought I had the luxury of being able to do that. And I ended up having to cut out the whole subplot, but I liked it so much that I saved it, and I definitely plan to use it in another story one day.
So Tanya and Steve, you both mentioned folders and files and flash drives and stuff. What do you use for writing your book? Do you write it on paper? Do you take your notes? Do you use, I believe it's Scrivener with all the little different files and folders, or just Microsoft Word? Or so what do you use to write your stories? What platform?
I do my early planning with a pencil and paper or a pen and paper. I like to do a lot of webbing and kind of scribbling around. Once I start the writing, I just do it in Microsoft Word and save each scene as a separate document so that I can change the order of them later if I have to. I don't put the whole thing together until I think I have a complete first draft.
Yeah, I use Scrivener for all my research. So I use it, everything related to a short story or a novella or a novel goes into a Scrivener file. And there I have all my research. I have my my original plot, all my character descriptions, every setting, everything is all documented there. But I've never gotten to the point where I was comfortable writing in Scrivener. So I still go back to Word. And I still write in Word.
Yeah, I got Scrivener a long time ago and have never gotten comfortable writing in Scrivener ever. And I write all of my short stories in Word. I don't even, and I like Steve's idea of keeping each scene as a separate piece so I can move them around, but I don't do that. I just write. And that does occasionally mean wholesale cutting and pasting and moving, but I just find for me it's easier to just start writing and keep going.
I'm old school that way. You know, I start at the beginning and just keep going, and then I end up having to revise the whole thing. But I do like Steve's idea. I might actually think about that.
It's very handy in rewriting if all of a sudden you decide scene 12 has to be later and it's scene 12 in the first draft. You do a save as, and now it's scene 21B. And I rewrite them several times so the numbers keep changing, but eventually you just find the last letter, maybe they're all G, and then you put them together in one document. But it saves a lot of time. It's easier than trying to highlight 5 pages and then scroll down another 180 and put it in, because that can get weird, especially with my astigmatism.
So when you're out in public and you all of a sudden have an idea, do any of you carry around like notepads or little DVRs or something? Or what was the most public place you were in when you came up with an idea and all of a sudden said, hey, quick, somebody get me a napkin?
I was in the bathroom and I ended up having to pull out a sheet of toilet paper, and I was writing against the wall with this long sheet of toilet paper and trying not to break the toilet paper as I was writing, but and I ended up using it in a story.
Yeah, I've been known to bring out my iPhone and do a voice record. I do that a lot because I don't always have something to read and write. When I was working full time, I would carry around the little notebook I held up. And sometimes in meetings, people would be going off talking, and I would be there scribbling in my little notebook. And the people who knew me knew that I had gotten the story idea.
Yeah, I carried a notebook with me. I worked in Boston for several years and took public transportation to work. And I carried a notebook, and I would record conversations I overheard. I recorded I jotted down all kinds of useful and interesting stuff.
I carried a notebook around for years and I almost never wrote in it. Now I have found, since I have a phone very often, I will, well, not very often, but sometimes I will email myself the idea just so that but I very rarely a bunch of stuff down. That goes back to when I was in a writing group years ago, and one of their ideas was, okay, we're all going to meet at Starbucks this Saturday, and we'll have our laptops so we can write. And I really got on a few people's bad side when I said, are we writing or are we showing people we're writers? And a few of them took that the wrong way.
So how difficult is it? Well, you got your story done, you've done all your editings and stuff. How much more difficult, if it is, to get a short story published versus a novel?
That's a loaded question.
It's a hard one to answer.
There's so many opportunities for short story writers though now with the internet. Most writers have, I think, I've been told, and I know I do, a list. Sort of where do you think the story's best going to fit? Which editor because you're writing to the editor, and this is what a lot of writers, beginning writers, don't recognize, is the fact that they'll mail it to one editor. I did this. I mailed it to a top journal or top magazine, got this nice personal rejection, and thought, oh, this means I'm not a good writer. So I quit writing for a couple of years. But I couldn't quit writing. I kept writing. I didn't mail it to anybody. But so you start with sort of your first choice and you go down the list, or you go down the list in terms of the editor that you think is going to like the story. Because after a while, if you're reading the magazines, you know what different editors want, the sorts of stories they like. And so where your sales percentages go up is when you're able to predict the kind of story that they're probably going to like, and you send that story to that editor.
I had a publisher for my first novel, and it was such a horrible experience, I started self-publishing the novels after that. As for short stories, if somebody takes a story and they do an edit and you really like the edit, I'll send them another story if it looks like something they'll take. I mean, there are 2 or 3 editors. I love what they do with my stories, and they're a joy to work with. They're encouraging, they're clear, they're concise. They're very helpful. At this moment, I have I have 13 stories out at various markets, and 3 or 4 that I will be sending out in the next few weeks. I'm just polishing up. For the record, though, the longest, the first story that I submitted that is still out went out in last November. I have 13 stories out since then. The most recent one was about 2 weeks ago. But you have to get used to the fact now some of the markets are just swamped. And some of them are only open 2 or 3 months of the year. So you have to kind of say, all right, if I'm going to write this kind of story and this person might take it, when will they be open? Do I have time to polish it?
So I had an interesting experience. There was an editor who I had gotten pretty much standard form rejections from, and I had just sort of resigned myself to this editor not liking my stuff. And so I finally said, I'm not going to bother. But there was a call for submission, and I had a story I thought would really suit this particular call for submission. So I sent it in, and I got back a very nice note from the editor saying, I love this story. And I sat down and figured out what it was that was different about this story versus other stories I had sent that editor. And I now have a much better and I've since published a couple more stories with that editor. And I think understanding, to Tanya's point, what those editors like and what they will, and I couldn't tell from reading other things that they had published, but I could tell from the reaction of what I had submitted, what might work again. So I think it really does mean that you have to, just like with agents, just like with book publishers, you have to really target your market. But to Tanya's point, there's way more opportunities for publishing short stories than there are for publishing novels. There just are.
And they're just, they're more open, you know, with so many, you know, publishing firms being swallowed up by bigger conglomerates. They're not allowing unagented work in, you know, and trying to find an agent is a full-time job in and of itself. So short stories give you the opportunity to send out to smaller presses. And I have a handful that I really love, and I know what they're looking for, and they seem to like my work. So, and I really love the editing jobs, you know, that they do on their finished products. And you can tell a lot from an anthology if it's polished, you know, and if it's the type of anthology that you want your work in and that you're going to be proud of, you know. So I think that goes a long way, you know, to what the type of publisher you're looking for, you know, and who you tend to stick with.
Is there a difference in the difficulty between getting into an anthology versus getting into a magazine, or does it matter? They're kind of the same. It just depends on the publisher and your story.
Well, a lot of the anthologies are publishing for a particular theme. For example, over the last couple of years, there have been anthologies of stories based on songs by Billy Joel, or songs based by Joni Mitchell, or songs from the 60s. So you get an idea, all right, this is the mindset of the editor, or they want something on a particular theme like revenge, or crimes of passion, or a cozy. And if that's the kind of writing that you're comfortable doing, if you can do something and get one in, there's a good chance you can get another one in if they do another anthology. I know some people who have been in 6 or 7 anthologies from the same publisher. I'm not one of them. But there are certain magazines that if the editor likes one story, that might be the first place you'll send another story if you think they have something in common. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Tanya, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, to Steve's point, one thing that I'm seeing is that a number of the anthology editors now are putting together a group of writers that they know they like their writing, they know they'll deliver on time, they'll meet the deadline because that's really important for them, and they don't send out open invitations. They only send the invitation to that group. And, you know, if you're a short story writer and that's mainly what you do, that's like nirvana for you, because now you're not having to go just send it blindly. You're sending it to somebody who knows your work and they like your work, and they usually, you know, they don't turn you down, then they just take the story. Or they'll have a big enough group because some of the people may not be able to make the deadline. So, you know, you may send a story in and it doesn't make it in, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to get your story in.
Yeah. Cheryl, do you want to add to that?
So I have not had the luxury of having an invitation to a particular anthology, but you can kind of tell whether a story will fit an anthology theme. Magazines have styles rather than themes. Just for example, between Hitchcock and Ellery Queen is noir and dark. Hitchcock seems to be quirkier and lighter, not necessarily light, but lighter. And so, for example, a story that works for one would not work for the other at all. And you just have to pay attention to those differences and send the stories in that work.
And also, for the most part, like Ellery Queen and Alfred Hitchcock are mystery magazines. Most of the magazines out there, I think, are literary, so they would be looking for literary pieces. And a lot of the times they tend to turn their noses down a genre, you know. So, you know, if you have a great story that you've written that doesn't fit into any particular genre and is a literary piece of work, it's worth sending it into a magazine, because that usually will open a lot of doors for you. You know, if you can get into a magazine, and if your goal is to get into an anthology, it would still help. It always helps when the editor of whatever you're trying to publish in knows that you're a serious writer and that you are submitting your work and that, you know, you have been published.
Have you ever gotten published in a magazine and that story ended up in an anthology, or if it wasn't long enough, you got it back and say, hey, expand on this a little bit so we can put this story in an anthology?
The anthology limits are usually the same as a magazine, so making it longer is not going to help or hurt you on the anthology. Most of the anthologies that I've submitted to or have been published in, it's been around 5,000 word limit. Some of them will be longer, but they're usually 5,000, just the same as a magazine.
Now we know writers. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things I used to think when I first started submitting was it's a 5,000 word limit. I should write 5,000 words. Just, I don't know, good doobie from my school days. You have to write a 20-page essay. So I'm going to write a 20-page essay, right? And then I realized as I wrote more that you want to use the number of words you need to use and no more.
Right.
And some of my best stories have actually been about half of what the anthology limits are, because I've worked hard to get just exactly what's needed and not more.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, editors always need the shorts, because particularly in an anthology, they've got so many words they're trying to hit. So they fill that with the longer ones that they love. But then they go and they look at the shorter ones and say, okay, now I've got 2,500 words to hit my limit. Is there a great 2,500 word short story? And if there is, they'll grab it.
I do want to say, sorry, Steve, I just want to mention that too, if anyone out there is a writer or is planning to write, flash fiction is a big thing right now, you know, so there are a lot of new anthologies coming out with new smaller presses that are looking for flash fiction pieces. So, you know, if you can write something that's 1,000 words or 1,500 words, it's a great way to get your foot in the door. Yeah.
So you had mentioned writers groups. Of course, Sisters in Crime is a great resource for writers, from everything from short stories all the way up to novels. Are there specific groups that you know of or belong to or had belonged to in the past that specifically are for helping people write short stories?
Well, there is Short Mystery Fiction Society, which is not about helping you to write short stories, but there is a wonderful discussion group that you can glean a lot from.
Including market news, including submission calls.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mystery Writers of America has panels occasionally. International Thriller Writers has a periodical that comes out as an online magazine every month, and that has a lot of interviews with writers and market news again. The Romance Writers of America has a very active group. Science fiction writers have some groups. There are a lot of groups out there. I'm not involved in science fiction, but
yeah, there's a lot of them.
There's also a lot of courses that people can take by established writers, and there are short story writers. Douglas Smith is a Canadian writer, and he's a full-time short story writer. He makes his living entirely off of short stories, and he does some great talks that he gives. He's got one called Playing the Short Game. It's a book, and he also does it as a presentation, a three-time presentation. So, you know, that supplements a lot of what you see too. Writers groups, critique groups, writers have to be careful about, because they're different flavors of them. Some of them can be people who are, it's best if you're going to join a writers group, a critique group, try to get somebody where everybody's ahead of you and they're better writers than you, then you can learn from them. You don't want to be in one where people are jealous of each other and just criticizing each other and may or may not be valid, their points. So you have to be very careful with critique groups.
Have any of you ever joined NaNoWriMo? Have you ever done that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit.
I do a workshop on getting ready for it. I used to do it in libraries in the fall. Since the pandemic, not so much.
I got 30 words into it one time, and that's about it for me. But
But they were
so
30
I did try, but
good words.
yes, it was. It was going to be a great story, blockbuster. So real quick, we only have a few minutes left. So if anybody does have any questions, please get them out now in the chat here so we can finish up. But so for each one of you, who is your favorite short story writer, and what is one takeaway that you got from them to help you in your writing?
Wow.
All right, I'll go. And this is not mystery at all, but Ray Bradbury. When I was a kid, I cut my teeth on science fiction novels and short story. That was before I even knew that Nancy Drew existed. I was reading science fiction. And Ray Bradbury is my very favorite. And I think what I took from him was the setting and I'm actually not even sure. I think I just absorbed it all in the skin at some point. But anyway.
I think the one that stuck with me was Shirley Jackson when I read The Lottery. And I was pretty young when I read that. And I was flabbergasted at how much impact she could put into just a few short words. And when I read that she wrote that story, I think it was like on the way back from the grocery store, and she wrote it in 20 minutes or something like that. And that's kind of like gone into the realm of mythology now. But when you mention short stories, that's what stuck with me. But I'm like Cheryl, I grew up reading science fiction, and so many sci-fi writers wrote short stories, and I cut my teeth on them.
Yeah. I don't think I can name just one. When Cheryl mentioned Ray Bradbury, yeah, definitely Bradbury. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, contemporary Laura Lippman writes wonderful short stories. She doesn't write them often. She's usually a novelist, but she has a book of short stories, and they're all terrific. Dennis Lehane has written some good short stories. 10 minutes after we're gone, I'll think of 50. But Flannery O'Connor. There are just so many.
Yeah. I also I grew up next to an Air Force base, right? Patterson Air Force Base, where they had experimental planes going on and off. My dad worked on the Mercury and the Gemini space program. So I grew up, my dad got me a telescope, a 3.5-inch refractor telescope when I was like 10 years old. So I wanted to be an astronaut until I found out I was a girl and couldn't do it. But I started out reading science fiction too. And I won't go over them because I think Steve and everybody else just sort of listed all the ones I grew up. Hemingway had a big influence on me. I loved the fact that he could write so succinctly. That was the thing that really grabbed me. And I read everything he did, and I studied everything he did, trying to write like that. And then I had to learn depth because I wasn't a Hemingway, but yeah.
So the final thing, you welcome everybody who has joined us. The final thing is, everybody, if you just give one piece of advice to any aspiring writers, what's the one piece thing? It could be the writing, it could be the marketing, it could be the publishing, it could be whatever. What's one piece of advice that you would give somebody?
Keep writing. And read a lot.
Just don't give up. Just keep writing and just keep submitting. Because when you stop submitting, you don't know the next publisher you submitted it to could have been the one that would have accepted you. So just don't give up.
For me, it's you have to trust that you have a story to tell. For the longest time, I wanted to write fiction and didn't think I had a great story, some great American novel in me. And the reality is we all have a story to tell. Our stories are our stories. And humans have a lot in common, but each of us experiences things differently. So trust that you have a story worth telling that people will want to read.
Yeah.
It begins with 30 words.
But it begins with 30 words.
Mine is rejections are your friends. People, I hear writers, they freak out when they get a rejection. And particularly with short stories, magazine editors are there, it's a business, and they're there to buy the stories that their readers are going to like. They know their readers. And so when you send a story, they also want to develop a connection between their readers and the writers who are submitting stories. So when they get your story, it may be a wonderful first story, but they've never seen you before. And so they're not probably going to publish you. They're going to give you a polite, personal rejection and hope that you have enough sense to send in your next story. When they see that you're submitting to them on a regular basis, then they think this is somebody serious. I'm going to buy their story. They're going to send me more stories. My writers will connect with them. And that's how you build your way into becoming a short story writer. So rejections are actually a very, very good thing for you. It means that you're submitting. And it also is great for tax purposes. I'll throw this in as the business side. And that is the IRS sees your rejections, they know you're trying to be a professional writer. And so save your rejections and then just send them back out to a different editor who may love them.
And with that, we're going to call it a night. I'd like to thank Tanya, Cheryl, Lorraine, and Steve for being a part of this, especially, and thank you to Sisters in Crime New England. They're fantastic writers, all of them. All four of their books, you can get them through us. Just give us a call. We can order them for you, or they're also available on bookshop.org. You can find the link, either go to bookshop.org and you can select our store, or you can go through our link to them, and we get a portion of sales from them, from any purchases. So either, like I said, call us, use bookshop.org, or go directly to our authors here. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Very much. Thanks for having us.
Take care.
Yes.
Bye, guys.